During the whole day, the enemy offered strong resistance, but in the evening he was obliged to retreat, leaving many of his men on the field of battle. Glorious as the day had been for the French arms, people in general were not satisfied with it, as it did not afford the results which had been hoped for. There was nothing decisive. The loss of General Gerard was particularly to be regretted. The night was far advanced when the enemy was in full retreat. Headquarters were quartered in a sort of chateau or country house not far from the field of battle. The next morning, the army moved against the English. The emperor went across the field of battle of the day before. When he reached the spot where the two roads met, he was greatly displeased at not finding Marshal Ney and his army corps there. His impatience showed itself in the highest degree. He had already waited for a long time when the head of a column was seen. They were hussars or chasseurs. He said to the general who was at the head, "What have you been doing all morning? The marshal's corps ought to have been here long ago. How much time have you made me lose?" He showed by reiterated expressions all the irritation which he felt at this delay, which stopped and suspended his operations. His horse, excited by the sound of the trumpets, kept turning to the right and left, and would not keep still. He seemed to share his rider's annoyance. The emperor could not comprehend this slowness on the marshal's part. It was only necessary for him to desire his lieutenants to show activity and rapidity in their marches, for them to be negligent in the execution of his orders. It seemed as though there was a collusion among them. It might be said that in this short campaign, everything conspired to go contrary to what the emperor wished. 2 days before, General Vidame, instead of arriving at Charleroi at noon, did not reach there till 3 o'clock. All these delays had as their consequence the terrible catastrophe of June 18th. As soon as the emperor had finished speaking, the column marched, and the soldiers, as they defiled before him, greeted him with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" 1,000 times repeated. The weather, which had been passable during the morning, turned to rain, and the water fell in such abundance that the plain became impassable. We were soaked to the bones. At a halt, the emperor asked for his cloak. At the entrance to a village on the main road, the chasseurs de cheval were in pursuit of a body of English cavalry. They were so covered with mud that their faces were no longer human. In these circumstances, they made prisoners of war of some English officers. The emperor was then on the right and close to the road. The spot was 7 or 8 feet above the causeway. One of the prisoners, who had the uniform of the hussars, grayish sky blue, passed by the emperor with a grave and disdainful air, which seemed to say, "Today I'm your prisoner, but tomorrow you and your army will be annihilated." He was on foot, free, and was making his way to the rear of the French army. A few minutes later, and in another spot equally close to the road, the emperor, seeing another officer of the same regiment as the preceding, had him brought to him. This one was wounded in the arm. The emperor questioned him through General Flao, who knew English and served as interpreter. When the officer had answered the questions which were put him, the emperor ordered his surgeon to dress his wound. This dressing was made a few steps behind His Majesty and close to the guard. It was the same officer who sent the emperor at St. Helena through his brother, who was in Canton, different articles of considerable value. As a sign of his gratitude, this officer was named Mr. Elphinstone. The articles consisted of a set of ivory chessmen, of 2 open work globes, also of ivory, and of a box containing counters of mother of pearl. Each piece had engraved on it a shield, on which was an end surmounted by a crown. All the middle of the day, the weather was very bad. It was only towards 3 or 4 o'clock that the rain ceased, but it remained foggy. The emperor, who arrived by a road which joins a high road to Brussels, went a quarter or half a league farther in advance, and we soon found ourselves on high ground, which commands the large basin bounded on the north by the curtain of the Forest of Soignes. The horizon, which was gray, did not permit the naked eye to see distinctly. We only saw on our left an English rear guard, followed by some French troops, where they fired from time to time cannon shots, whose smoke we could see. It was near the end of the day, a little while after the emperor had finished examining the whole plain with his glass. An immense line of fire shone in our eyes. It was the English artillery, which showed the immense front of its army in line of battle. There was only a single volley, then nothing more was heard but a few shots fired on the left, both by our advance guard and by the enemy rear guard, which was retiring. It was night, or nearly that, when the emperor reached at Caillou Farm. He fixed his headquarters there. At his room, it was not ready. They made a bivouac fire near the building. These were to the right of the road, and there, lying on a bundle of straw, he waited while his room was being put in order to receive him. When he had taken possession of the little hovel in which he was to pass the night, he had his boots taken off, and we had trouble in doing it, as they had been wet all day. And after dressing, he went to bed. Were he dying? That night he slept little, being disturbed every minute by people coming and going. One came to report, another to receive orders. The next day, the 18th, the Emperor rose fairly early. He breakfasted with the Grand Marshal, the Duke Dalmatian, some other persons, and then mounted his horse, followed by the Major General, the Duke of Dalmatia, the Grand Marshal, General Fuller, and all his suite. We went to the advanced post to reconnoiter the positions occupied by the enemy and lead out in order of battle. When all the corps had carried out their movements, he passed through the ranks, where he was received with enthusiasm, after which he came and took his position back of Rusam. The action began at the park of Hougomont. At this place was only a little way off. We could clearly see the attack and defense. It was with great difficulty that we succeeded in dislodging the enemies from it, as the other parts of the line of battle were distant or concealed by inequalities of the ground. We could not see clearly with the naked eye the different movements which took place. A good part of the day had passed, and it was but slowly that we gained any ground. In the afternoon, General Bulaw's Prussian Corps, which had been taken at first for Marshal Grouchy's, commenced to make some progress and to give the enemy some chance of success. It was, I think, 3 or 4 o'clock at the moment when the first Prussian bullets came to our right, and I was sent to the Caillou farm to let Pierrot and the Major Domo to bring something to eat, as the Emperor and some of his suite needed to take some nourishment. As I went, only a few bullets flew across the causeway, but on my way back there were a good many, not far away and behind the spot where the Emperor was there, a hollow road in which a great number of the English guards were killed, horse guards. We knew them by their height and by their large helmets with black crests. When Bulaw had been driven back, the Emperor sent forward the battalions of the old guard against the English. The cavalry had already been thrown in. Our wounded, who were very numerous, showed us the obstinacy with which the English resisted. Among the wounded, I saw General Friant, who was still on horseback. A few minutes later, Colonel Maillet, who was being carried by his soldiers. The latter, recognizing me, made me a sign to give him a drop of brandy. I gave it to him at once. I was carrying the Emperor's flask. The Emperor, who half an hour before, perhaps longer, had left the greater part of his staff and his guard to direct the attack of the infantry of the guard, came back to us half an hour later. Night was beginning to cover the field of battle when Marshal Blucher came into action on our right and carried disorder into some French regiments. On this disorder, spreading from one to another, soon became general. The guard was obliged to change front and then form squares, in which one of them, the Emperor and his suite, took refuge to escape from the Prussian cavalry, which was overrunning the field of battle. When the squall blew over, the Emperor gave the order to retreat. Bulaw's corps, which had resumed the offensive and which was already cutting the main road, threatened to surround us entirely. The Emperor's carriage and the household transport had remained at the Caillou farm. The Emperor's carriage was taken during the evening. The postilion, Horn, who drove it, not seeing room to extricate it from the carts and other vehicles which obstructed the road, seeing the Prussian cavalry on the point of cutting him off, and besides that, seeing cannonballs and bullets falling around him, unhitched his horse, while the first footman, Archambault, took the portfolio and dressing case out of the carriage. This remained where it was and almost immediately fell into the hands of the Prussians, who pillaged it, as well as Marchand's, which contained the Emperor's clothes. There was a sword which was forgotten by Archambault. It was in all respects like that which His Majesty was wearing, except that on this latter was written on the broadest face of the sword those words inlaid in gold: the sword which the Emperor wore at the Battle of Austerlitz. I have never heard anyone speak of the sword which was taken in the carriage. What has become of it? It seems to me that I have read somewhere that it fell into Wellington's hands. It is more probable that some Prussian soldier got it, broke off the blade, and kept the hilt, as only being of real value to him. This hilt was of gold, as were the trimmings of the scabbard. To come back to Horn, this poor fellow had his arm carried away by a ball during the confusion. The next day, as Blucher was riding over the field of battle with some of his officers, he stopped before Horn, who was sitting on a stone, and asked him who he was. The Bastilian replied to him in German that he belonged to His Majesty's household and drove His Majesty's carriage. Blucher, who was a very violent and fiery man and had a heart full of hatred and vengeance against him with whom he had had to do on the 16th, overwhelmed the unfortunate man with abuse and had the cruelty, one may say the barbarity, when Horn made some reply to give him a blow. If the marshal had been a different sort of man, would he not have had the poor devil's wound dressed and have given him money rather than to maltreat him as he did? Later, when the carriage had been bought by an Englishman, Horn described it to the people to whom it was exhibited.